This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant. Available now online for you to learn at your own pace with a certificate available upon completion. Click the link in the show notes to access today for just €50. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 4 of our 5-part series about acquiring coffee knowledge. And today on the podcast, Simon, we are going to talk about trends in coffee knowledge transfer. So one of the interesting trends that I think that has come up in the past few years is something that actually came out of the pandemic, which was when coffee producers were looking for a way to handle some of the scenarios that they were dealing with, where they had extra fruits and extra, they had to solve some problems for themselves. And so they decided to use this fruit as a part of processing coffees. It took off. It got given the name of infused coffees by certain people in the industry. It became a trend. And then there became this divide of whether this trend was a good trend, it's not a good trend. It kept evolving. So different producers started to push it into different directions. The same thing happened with fermentation. All of these trends started happening. We recently had a guest on the podcast, Andreas Felipe Ospina, and he was talking about the koji trend. And he was talking about the damage that did and is continuing to do in certain producing countries, because they're using a koji that's not native to Colombia and it's killing everything in its wake from a microbial perspective. So there are all of these trends. And then somebody who's cool or famous turns around and says that either this trend is a good trend or it's not a good trend. To me, that's knowledge transfer. When you subjectively decide whether a trend is something that should be followed or not, now all of a sudden, you are using that power that you have as a cult leader to disseminate your opinion on whether knowledge is correct or not. What are your thoughts on this way of knowledge transference?
I think the interesting thing is that this question and this example of the fact that there are trends in the industry, we've seen that with roast profiles, we've seen that with the way espressos are being served with fermentation, including koji, including yeast and bacteria, and including fruits and infusing with in different ways. There are different trends, and I think to me it all goes back to that subjectivity aspect, where there are some people who are in favor of certain trends, people who are against specific trends, and this is when you have divergence of opinions, and some people will sort of try to establish the fact that this is the right way of doing things, and other people also say, no, this is the wrong way of doing things. I don't really have an opinion on this, generally speaking. However, I do believe that people, like consumers, should just decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong. Like, what coffees do you enjoy? What coffees do you not enjoy? And regardless of whether this is a trend and regardless of whether this is right or wrong, I think it all comes down to the final cup and to this sort of like very objective aspect of what are the qualities of this coffee with following this specific trend. So I mean, people can give their opinion on specific trends, whether they like it or not, but for someone to come out and say, this is the right way to do things, this is the wrong way to do that, I think to me it's a big red flag from an expert point of view, because as an expert, you're supposed to also take your distance, unless there's a health hazard or a risk associated to it. Then it's important to sort of raise awareness around that. But for an expert to go out their way and have a strong opinion on that based on personal preference, or it could even be like financial interest, I think this is wrong. And to me, as someone who's witnessing a message like such a message, it raised a big red flag. So
It shows a lack of openness, and it shows a lack of, I guess, general expertise in this idea of being curious about the way business is being conducted, the way that agriculture is being conducted, the way that producers need to adapt to changing economic circumstances. You know, decisions are made not just based on taste. It's such an entitled perspective from the consuming end of the market to turn around and decide that this is something that producers should or shouldn't do, just because somebody has an opinion about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. Like some of the some trends around in infused coffees, like we've seen infused coffees for a long time. It's something that has been around for a very long time, where even roasters were infusing coffee with vanilla and chocolate and caramel at some point. And now it's being done a little bit more in producing countries for some of the reasons that you mentioned. I think to me, the thing that strikes me the most with this specific topic is that there's a win-win situation where there's a lot of fun consumers that love these coffees, and there are producers who are willing to do these coffees and that also have financial interest in doing that. So if you're sort of sitting in the middle, preventing producers and consumer from connecting, I think that's definitely problematic. But everyone is entitled to have their own opinion, and I think about specific trends and specific coffees, etc. But the thing that you see in the coffee industry, and you see that in many other industries, is that because it's still quite young, there's a lot of new trends and it's constantly shifting and there's new things coming all the time. And for what I found is that for a lot of people, that's very unsettling, because your knowledge is constantly being challenged. And some people don't like that, because when your knowledge is challenged, then your expert status is challenged, which means that, and you've probably experienced that working in cafes where the head barista, someone with more experience, has been working behind the bar for 15 years, is now being challenged by new styles of extractions and different ways to temp. When we finally discovered that temping and knocking with the temper on the portafilter was a terrible thing, then you have a whole bunch of very experienced people who felt very threatened by this. When the puck press came out, this innovation came out, I remember everyone, when the automatic temper came out, a lot of people were sort of like felt threatened by this. Yep. They felt like this was wrong and it was removing the craftsmanship from coffee making, etc. And you see this with innovation, you see this with new trends, and you see this with new things coming out. And I think something that's important is to remain versatile with what you know and to become comfortable and even excited to be proven wrong and to learn new things. And I think that's the thing that I've been having this conversation with many people that do find it frustrating in coffee, that you know a certain number of things, but because it's such a complex product that you're always being proven wrong by coffee. I do blind tastings on a daily basis to understand specific variables. So typically in the morning, I'll brew two of the same coffee. I'll just change one variable. I'll do blind tasting. And then if I do that, 2-3 times a day over a whole year, I've basically tested 2,000 variables or the same variable multiple times. So it helps me build this understanding. And by doing a blind tasting, I try to build a hypothesis on, okay, I think that this specific variable, like this specific paper filter, will increase acidity and reduce body. I build this hypothesis and then I verify it. And if I can predict it, then I understand this variable. And a lot of the time I get it wrong. And, I think that, this is the light paper filter and this is the darker paper filter, or like whatever variable it is, or I think this is this water mineral composition, I think this one is that. And it's unsettling because I do consider myself a coffee expert in specific areas, and getting it wrong doesn't feel good. Yeah, but I think I've sort of learned how to make peace with that and even be excited about that. I think what really excites me is that I wake up in the morning and I know that I'm going to learn new things about coffee. And if I didn't learn new things about coffee, I'd be very bored. I'd be very unexcited to do some more testings and more experiments. So in general, I think when you look at trends, a lot of people feel threatened by them. They feel threatened by innovation as well. And to me, it's all about getting comfortable being wrong and also having the vulnerability to say that you're wrong. But I think it all comes down to, we didn't really talk about that in what makes an expert, but when you look at, and I think that's something that's cultural, but when you look at the educational system in many countries, the teacher in primary school is this godlike figure that's right about everything, and whatever the teacher says is correct. And same thing with our parents. Our parents say things, and we as kids believe that it's true, and because our parents are the most respected human beings on the planet when we're kids, and they are like gods and goddesses. But I think it's important from early on to realize that
they're just people.
We're humans, and people mess up, and people are wrong, and we need to accept that, and we need to be able to be willing to be upfront with it and to say, I was wrong. That's, I made this statement and I was wrong about it. And there's nothing, I mean, it's very human. I find it incredibly admirable when people have this vulnerability to say, I was wrong about this, you were right about that. And there's this same thing with trends, I think, where people get uncomfortable with innovation because it's threatening what they know, it's threatening what they think is true. And again, I think people just should just make their own opinion about new trends. Some trends are just temporary, some trends are there to stay. When geisha as a variety became popular, some people thought it was going to be for a short period of time, and then it became massive. And we see that with other varieties. When pink bourbon emerged a couple of years ago in Colombia, I heard many people say, this is the new geisha, this is the new geisha. I didn't quite become the new geisha. And then we had this with Sidra, and we had this with a whole bunch of varieties, and some new varieties became the new geisha in a way. But so there are trends that are here to stay. There are trends that are just a fad, but at the end of the day, it's up to each and every one of us to decide what we believe or what we think of these trends, if it's a right thing, or if it's right or if it's wrong. And also you did mention something important, to look at the whole value chain to understand what are the implications of these trends. Because geisha, for example, I love geisha as a variety. It's probably one
as
of my...
As much as Sudan Remy?
Well, I do like Sudan Remy.
Yeah, you do.
There's a few varieties that are really enjoyable, and geisha is one of them. I could drink geishas all day long. I think they're amazing varieties. But when it emerged, there's a whole bunch of producers around the world that started planting geishas, and geisha grows in Boquete in Panama better than in other areas at low altitude with high sun exposure and more stress on trees. And that's sort of like put some producers in a situation where they've produced geishas. The geisha trees are low yield, that are a little bit more susceptible to disease, and are not as financially viable to grow. And that's put some producers in a pretty dire situation. And the end consumer, actually, the demand for geisha is maybe not even that high, because only specialty coffee professionals drink geisha and are willing to pay the premium price for it. But
who's the market?
Average? Yeah, who's the average? I mean, the average consumer that drinks a flat white with 2 sugar couldn't care less about that. So it's very interesting to look at a specific trend from multiple point of view. Like, I mean, I like this variety, and I think it's a great. For example, Koji is a good example. We've done at Zest some work with some producers around Koji last year, and we did conduct some Koji workshops late last year around the country. And Koji is incredible as a way to convert sugars in coffee and to unlock different flavors. And it's incredibly easy to set up and incredibly accessible and cheap for producers. But there are other implications, like introducing foreign microbes into a new environment. Which if it's not controlled properly, can seen that with it's happening in other industries where specific fungus in winemaking were introduced in other regions and have sort of like destabilized the entire ecosystem and it's in a given place. So there are pros and cons to a lot of these trends, and I think it's important to have a look at all of them, and again to have a little bit of critical thinking, to sort of like ask yourself, is this information reliable? Who is backing this information? And to take a little bit of perspective with some of that.
And you set us up perfectly for the next conversation.
For the last one, exactly.
We're going to talk about critical thinking in coffee. That was the perfect setup. So join us for the next episode, the final of the series, folks, where we are going to talk about critical thinking in coffee. This is perhaps the thing that really led to Map It Forward being started, this podcast being started 7-ish years ago. So join us for the next episode. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, friends. There are 2 ways you can support this podcast. Firstly, become a paid member of our YouTube channel. Secondly, you can join our Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video before you leave, and check the show notes for more information. Now, this is what you should check out next.